I want to look at 5 problems with gross domestic product. This is my personal list, if you will. They're not original, but most economists understand this, and they might have the list longer or change it. But these are 5 major points to make. The first one I want to look at is household activities. I've mentioned this a bit earlier, but if you grow vegetables in your backyard, that means vegetables are not included in gross domestic product because there's no market price. Whereas if you buy them in a grocery store, they are included. This means that GDP only includes market transactions. It excludes non-market. So if you bake a cake at home, the ingredients you purchase, if you bought them from a store, are included. But if you what you do at home is not. If you go to a bakery and purchase it, well, and what's the difference really? You might say the one you make at home is better than the one you buy in the bakery. But if you buy the cake and the ingredients might cost you $4 or $5, if you buy it in a bakery, it's going to be $35, and GDP reflects that difference. A classic story is the economist talks sexist story, but imagine a maid or a handyman. A woman hires a handyman to work around the house. Fixing things, she pays him, so the market wage and that work that he performs would be added to gross domestic product. And the inevitable happens. It's like a romantic comedy. They get married, and so now the handyman just is a husband. He's around the house fixing things, doesn't get paid for it, and so as a result, GDP would go down. And yet there's really no difference to what's going on before. This is pernicious in a way because it means that GDP does not accurately reflect the economic activity in a country. More dramatically, maybe, is I believe now in the United States, about half of all meals are eaten in a restaurant or a cafeteria. And so as a result, GDP is very high, relatively high. If I compare that with, say, a country like, say, China, where maybe one meal per year is eaten in a restaurant, because some people are preparing food at home. Even think of prepared food. A lot of countries where people buy the ingredients, do all the work at home, preparing the kitchen and in the kitchen themselves. And this is not reflected in gross domestic product. So you can get, depending on the country and the circumstance, the situation, you can get kind of a biased perspective of this. There's a very good article by an economist, Gary Becker. He won a Nobel Prize in economics for this kind of work, by the way. He wrote a very simple little article explaining this issue and explaining also why this has serious policy implications, because it gives us kind of a false impression about what activities are important and which are not within an economy. That's my first point. Second point, shadow or black economy. This is going to vary upon the country, but if you babysit for a neighbor or maybe somebody hires work for a home renovation, in Quebec and Canada, it's likely that this is not included in gross domestic product. It should be, though, because it's a final good or service. There's a market price, there's a wage. The question here is whether Statistics Canada captures this or collects this kind of information to include it in gross domestic product. Estimates I've seen is around 5 or 6, 7% of Canada's gross domestic product. Other countries, on the other end, it can be quite substantial. Think of marijuana, for example. In the United States, there's many jurisdictions where it's illegal. I doubt that the United States government includes it. In the case of Canada, I've heard it's around $2 billion. So it's not a significant portion of the Canadian economy. But in any event, the issue is not whether it's legal or not legal or whether people pay taxes or not. The question is how accurate to make the GDP statistics. And in some countries, it can be the black economy or shadow economy can be as 20, 30%. So if you're looking at GDP statistics, again, the example of Colombia. Colombia produces coffee and they produce cocaine. Colombia doesn't produce cocaine because they like it, because there's a market outside of Colombia for it. But the point here is that if you wanted to make a macroeconomic model of the Colombian economy, it'd probably be necessary to include something about their cocaine exports, and because it would have an effect on making predictions of what the exchange rate is going to do. Third point, government purchases. I've mentioned that this is included in gross domestic product. It's true, but they're included at the price the government pays for the purchase. But that doesn't mean that society benefits at that point or that value that's given to it. If you think for a second, if the government hires me, for example, or as a teacher or somebody to do work, the GDP goes up by my salary. But it's not obvious that GDP or the value that people receive from my teaching skills is equal to my salary. The issue here a little bit is if you go to McDonald's and you buy a Big Mac for $6, then it's probably fair to say that you get $6 of value. Otherwise, you wouldn't have bought the Big Mac. But that's not always the case when the government buys something. Pick an extreme example is that if, say, the government buys a cruise missile, like $20 million or something, GDP goes up by $20 million. Do we get the value from that thing? I don't know. It's another example, the classic one is a $50 million helicopter that doesn't fly. I think Canada has submarines, or we've been building ships for several years, and anytime the government buys something like that, GDP goes up by the value. So in this sense, be cautious, because gross domestic product is not a measure of happiness or something of that nature. Negative externalities, this is a relevant one too. GDP does not take into account anything to do with the environment. So if there's some kind of environmental destruction or anything that degrades the environment, GDP is unaffected. And in fact, it could be pernicious in the sense that if there's an oil spill and the government has to hire people to clean up the work, GDP actually goes up because of the salaries paid to these workers that are doing something, which is a bit kind of like incorrect. Or pick another example, like crime. I would rather live in a society where there's less crime or no crime. But in a country where there's crime, well, then you've got to hire police, adds to gross domestic product. You've got to have a judicial system, prison. The fact that state or private prisons or state is irrelevant. It's that the government has to pay for these things, and this adds to gross domestic product. So GDP would be higher. Perhaps the biggest one of all, though, is leisure. Is that if you go to the cinema, you buy a ticket, the purchase of a ticket, I'll assume you're seeing a Canadian movie, well, that GDP goes up by the price of the ticket. But if you go to a park with your friends, spend the afternoon, GDP is unaffected, except maybe the city has to hire workers to landscape, to maintain the park. But other than that, but the benefit you get from these two activities is maybe better to the park, but GDP does not reflect this. It only includes market transactions. Here's an extreme example. You've got two countries. In country A, people work in the morning, they work in the afternoon. Country B, they work in the morning and they hang out with their friends in the afternoon. Country A is going to have a higher GDP. Country B will have a lower GDP. Which country would you rather live in? Now, keep in mind what this means. Country A will have more physical resources. They're going to have better roads, more ambulances, hospitals may be better, and so on. That's true. They've got a higher GDP. But the conclusion I can make about these points that I've made is that there have been efforts. The United Nations, for example, came up with something called the HDI, Human Development Index, but that's completely arbitrary. What they've done in the United Nations is the statisticians took a variety of numbers from different countries and put them together and said, well, let's see what this means, so we can compare countries. But this is not based on macroeconomic theory. My feeling is that ultimately GDP, it's a variable that comes from a macroeconomic model. It's on the horizontal axis. It represents an important variable in understanding what the economy is doing, as Keynes originally intended this idea of national income or national economic activity. And it should be considered that way. But to stop and think a little bit about this, consider the various things you or your family maybe did today. You got up this morning, you made some coffee. Coffee maybe was imported, but you made the coffee. If you went to Tim Hortons, you bought the coffee, well then that would be part of gross domestic product. If you took the metro, you bought a metro ticket, that's part of GDP. Maybe you took notes in the class, but that's not, are the notes of any value? These are the various things that people go about in their daily lives, and they're all important in an economic sense. But from a standpoint of a macroeconomic model, they may or may not be part of GDP, and